Apartheid. Of course, it's easiest to describe in the West Bank, where it's so stark, where Israeli settlers and Palestinians live under totally separate sets of laws. Israeli settlers live under Israeli civil law, and they're subject to the jurisdiction of Israeli civilian police. Palestinians live under what is in effect an Israeli military dictatorship. And they are both occupied by the Israeli army and the settlers and have no recourse really to justice beyond the forces that are occupying them. The Palestinian Authority, of course, exists since the 1990s under the Oslo Accords, but the Palestinian Authority, I would argue, functions effectively as an extension of the Israeli occupation, a kind of a native police force that has been typical in colonial regimes in Palestine and in other parts of the world as well. What does Israeli military rule look like for Palestinians? I'll just give a few examples to illustrate it because there are really too many otherwise. One is the system, this has come back into the public eye recently, the system of administrative detention. What is administrative detention? It's a little bit like what we have been introducing in the United States in recent years, where people can be held indefinitely without charge or trial. So one case that was very much in the public eye recently was the case of Hamideh Adnan. He is a Palestinian from Jenin in the West Bank who went on hunger strike for 66 days, the longest hunger strike in Palestinian history, and one of the longest recorded in the world. Some of you in this room, I know, like me, will remember the Irish hunger strikes of 1980 and 81, which gathered global attention to the struggle in Northern Ireland. And Bobby Sands, one of the most known of the 10 men who died on hunger strike in Northern Ireland, died after 66 days. So Hamideh Adnan, his hunger strike lasted 66 days. He was arrested on December 17th from his home in the middle of the night. He wasn't carrying a gun, he wasn't out attacking anyone, he was taken from his family home and taken into administrative detention. That means detention without charge or trial. The Israelis simply hold you in prison and they don't tell you why. They say we have secret evidence. Administrative detention orders can be renewed indefinitely. In other words, they will issue an administrative detention order for 4 months, and then when it expires, simply renew it again, without telling you why. Of course, if you followed the case of Hamideh Adnan in the media, you had Israeli government spokespeople, including on Twitter, saying Hamideh Adnan is a dangerous terrorist, and he's a member of Islamic Jihad, which is a group that has carried out violent attacks on Israel. Well, very well, but you know, you can't try him on Twitter. You know, and if you're going to do that, at least give him a Twitter account so he can respond. Do what Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Carter Center, and many others have said. Release him or charge him with a crime and try him according to international standards. Because another important thing to remember is that for Palestinians in the West Bank, there are no trials according to international standards. You are taken for any offense before a military court, for any accusation, before a military court where the prosecutors and the judge are officers of the Israeli occupation army. And where the conviction rate against Palestinians, only Palestinians are tried in Israeli military courts, is 99%. So there is no justice whether they charge you or not. But they don't even go through the motions of charging people. Right now, a woman called Hana al-Shalabi, who is 29 years old, she spent 2.5 years in administrative detention. No charge or trial. She was released last October as part of the prisoner exchange between Hamas and Israel. And Israel rearrested her on February 17th. And since then, she has been on hunger strike now for 14 days because she's being held without charge or trial. It's very important to know how pervasive these practices are. Currently, there are 309 Palestinians being held without charge or trial, including, remember, Israel and the rest of the world constantly lectures Palestinians about democracy, including 21 elected members of the Palestinian Legislative Council. They were elected in 2006 in an election which the United States and other countries insist Israel, the Palestinians hold. And since then, they were arrested and are being held without charge or trial, simply, I guess, for the crime of being elected. There are 166 children in Israeli prisons as well, currently. So that gives you a sense of course, thousands of Palestinians have experienced administrative detention, and thousands more are in prison having been sentenced by these military occupation courts. So that's life in the West Bank, in addition to the roadblocks, the checkpoints, the land confiscations that Desmond Tutu described. And as I mentioned, settlers live under totally separate law. A settler committing a crime in the same place as a Palestinian is subject to Israeli civil law and enjoys all the protections that are afforded by the Israeli legal system to civilians in Israel. So you have two totally separate systems of law for in the same place, and the difference is which ethno-religious group you belong to. So that's really, I think, the essence of apartheid in a sense. Gaza is a totally different kind of apartheid because you have there really a total separation. You have 1.5 million people, just over, 80% of them refugees. I mentioned the expulsions in 1948. Most of the population in Gaza originate in towns and villages that were all over this area, and they were concentrated in the Gaza Strip. So it's a different kind of separation. It's not apartheid on a person-to-person basis. It's a whole population being segregated in a very compact enclosure, one of the most densely populated places on earth, simply because those people don't fit the dominant ethno-religious category. If Palestinians in the Gaza Strip were Jews, they wouldn't be subjected to this treatment by Israel. They would be allowed to live wherever they wanted and return to their land. So that the defining characteristic, the defining reason why Palestinians are subjected to this separation in Gaza is because they are not Jews. Of course, Israel offers a different explanation. Israel talks always about security and say we have to do this for security. Although Israel has never explained how chocolate and cinnamon and soda and potato chips and building supplies entering Gaza would be a threat to its security. These are all things that have been tightly restricted either now or at various times in recent years from entering the Gaza Strip. And in fact, we know that from documents released by the Israeli Ministry of Defense to an Israeli human rights group called Gisha, which means access, that Israel operates a regime designed to keep Gaza on the edge of the economic precipice at all times. And according to the documents released by the Israeli Defense Ministry, the Israelis have calculated formulas by which they calculate how many calories each person in Gaza needs just to keep Gaza on the edge of that precipice. But more important than that is the assault on Gaza's economic viability. Gaza is resource poor in terms of natural resources. There's very few natural resources there. There's the people, many of whom are very highly educated. I have many friends in Gaza who are college age, your age, very ambitious. Many of them are on Twitter, and you can follow them and talk to them. Some of them write for the Electronic Intifada. We have fabulous bloggers from Gaza who write every day about just about any topic. And so if you know them, if you encounter some of these young people, you'll know that they're as capable, as ambitious, as bright as young people anywhere in the world. Many of them now are studying by candlelight in the dark because power to Gaza is still cut off for 8 to 10 hours a day, every day, to this day. I think if you imagine your lives at Oberlin with no electricity for half the day, for any purpose, not just for your computers and internet, but to wash clothes, to prepare food, simply to read a book, you can begin to understand the extent of this situation, which is totally artificial. It's created. It's not due to a tsunami or a natural disaster. It's imposed by the regime of separation that exists. Gaza had a very productive agricultural base until Israel cut off all exports from the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip produced about 400,000 tons a year of fresh vegetables, fruits, cut flowers, most of which was exported to the European Union, or about a third of which was exported to the European Union. And for the past few years, exports have fallen to almost zero. During the attack on Gaza in 2008, 2009, much of the irrigation infrastructure was deliberately targeted and destroyed, as well as industries. Several 100,000 chickens were killed when Israel deliberately bombed chicken coops. The only flour mill in Gaza was bombed and destroyed. So there's a total decimation of the economic and productive base, forcing most of the population to become dependent on UN rations, and then Israel tightens the screws on those rations to keep people under control. And that's not to mention, I think it's very important not to reduce Gaza to an issue of food and humanitarian supplies, because it's really about fundamental human rights. In addition to restricting goods and imports and exports, the movement. So let me talk about Palestinians in Israel. I mentioned earlier